Heyo, welcome to the next general psych lecture. This next series of videos is going to cover emotion, motivation, and stress. It's kind of a connection between our recent discussion of personality and our upcoming discussion of clinical psych. So we're going to start by primarily talking about emotions in this video. And so let's start the starting with a small inventory. So you're going to rate all of the statements on the first three slides here on a scale from 1 to 7. You can use the number 4 if you feel neutral about the question. You'll use 1 to indicate that you completely disagree with the statement, and you'll use 7 to indicate that you completely agree with the statement. And so then 2, 3, 5, and 6 are going to be the sort of partway points in between those. So 5, for example, would be that you somewhat agree. 6 would be that you mostly agree, all the way up to 7. Completely, or as I've written here, totally agree. So number 1, whenever I feel positive emotions, people can easily see exactly what I am feeling. With that from 1 to 7. And all the rest. 2, I sometimes cry during sad movies. 3, people often do not know what I'm feeling. 4, I laugh out loud when someone tells me a joke that I think is funny. 5, it's difficult for me to hide my fear. 6, when I'm happy, my feelings show. If you need more time, pause the video. 7, my body reacts very strongly to emotional situations. 8, I've learned it's better to suppress my anger than to show it. 9, no matter how nervous or upset I am, I tend to keep a calm exterior. 10, I have an emotionally expressive person. Sorry, it sounded like I said have. I am an emotionally expressive person. Remember, 1 to 7, 1 completely disagree, 4 neutral, 7 completely agree. 11, I have strong emotions. 12, I'm sometimes unable to hide my feelings even though I would like to. Pause the video if you need more time on this slide. 13, whenever I feel negative emotions, people can easily see exactly what I'm feeling. 14, there have been times when I've not been able to stop crying even though I tried to stop. 15, I experience my emotions very strongly. 16, what I'm feeling is written all over my face. So to score this inventory, you're going to be computing averages, but before then, you have to reverse a couple of items. So items 3, 8, and 9 are reverse scored, and what that means is that if you rated it a 1, you need to change your answer to a 7 to be able to score it. Or if you rated it a 2, change it to a 5, and vice versa. If you made it a 5, it's now a 2. If you rated it a 3, it's now a 6. Or, oof, well, I misspoke grossly there. 1s become 7s, 7s become 1s, 2s become 6s, and 6s become 2s, 3s become 5s, and 5s become 3s, and 4s stay the same for items 3, 8, and 9. Once you've done that flip-flopping, average the numbers as they are set up here: 3, 5, 8, 9, 13, and 16, and then 1, 4, 6, and 10, and then 2, 11, 12, 14, and 15. And then also, you can average all of them together, I believe, to get a total emotionality score. But the first set will give you a negative emotionality facet, the second set will give you a positive emotionality facet, and then the third will give you an impulse strength facet. And this generally is a test of, or short, of course, test of emotionality. So it'll give you an idea for how strongly you feel your emotions. It comes from a paper cited here on the slide. So now you've got a couple scores for yourself, right, over these last few videos. You've got a locus of control score, you've got a big 5 outcome, and so maybe combine that with these scores, and you can start to get maybe a fuller picture of you as a person that starts to reflect how you actually see yourself. So it's a couple of nice points going on in there. First of all, no one measure captures an entire person. And number 2, psychology does a pretty darn good job of putting together a series of measures that can actually give us an idea of who a person is. And so this is why sometimes you'll do studies that start with what we call a test battery, where you'll do like the locus of control test, the emotionality test, and the Big Five before you get to the actual study of interest. And the reason for that is to try to take a snapshot of who you are before you start. Now we're going to use this emotionality outcome today to fill in our conversation today, in which I'm going to talk about how psychologists think about emotion for a while, and we'll finish by thinking about how emotion and personality are connected, and the answer is very, very tightly. We should first define emotion, though, which is, as in many cases in psych, a little harder than it sounds. Imagine, for example, that an alien landed from outer space and you had to explain emotion to the alien. Think about what you'd say. You'd probably start by saying, well, emotions are ways that we feel. Okay, what if the alien doesn't understand the word feel? What is fool? You could maybe demonstrate some of the emotions. You could cry if you can cry on command. You could smile and frown. You could act angry. But what if you do that and the alien doesn't understand? Like, why does water pouring out of your eyes have something to do with this word emotion? How is that related? And so you can kind of think about it like describing a concept to a person who has no understanding of it, or who has no kind of framework surrounding the conversation. And imagine you tried to describe the different colors to somebody who was born blind. You could say like blue is cool and red is warm, and that maybe would have some help for them, but in general, just trying to describe how green differs from blue is going to be pretty near impossible. Same as trying to explain emotion to an alien that doesn't have them. You know, I just realized I used like a goofy alien voice. I should have done a Spock voice. We'll just move on. So as psychologists define emotion, it has three facets. Facet one, the feeling state that accompanies the emotions. So that's the subjective experience, the thing that we actually feel, the answer you would give if somebody asked you, how are you feeling? So that part is similar between the way we talk about it colloquially in everyday language and the way psychologists talk about it. Facet two, the physical changes, so things like increased heart rate, increased skin temperature, or activation of rain pouring out of your eyes. All that is also an integral part of what makes an emotion. And number three, cognitive appraisal. The beliefs, the understandings, the things we think about why we feel the way we feel. So it's pretty clearly agreed upon that these three are the facets of emotion in people, but the directionality of these facets is debated. Which affects which other is not necessarily perfectly defined. It's something that psychologists still debate. The James Lange theory was the first of these. The theory suggests that the physiological response to the stimulus causes the experience of an emotion. So in other words, we feel afraid because our heart pounds. A stranger approaches, a tiger approaches, your heart begins to pound, your cognitive system realizes my heart is pounding, therefore I must be feeling an emotion and I think it's afraid, and then you feel the feeling itself. You have the subjective experience. The Cannon-Bard theory, on the other hand, proposes that the physiological response and the emotion happen at the exact same time. They happen simultaneously. And then the combo of those is what enables us to cognitively appraise the feeling. Schachter and Singer's two-factor theory, on the other hand, focuses on the interplay of thinking and feeling rather than the timing of feelings. And this is kind of the approach I prefer. Why worry about the timing of it? Well, I understand why somebody would and why it would be an interesting thing to research. But for me personally, I think it's easier to discuss if we just say, to experience emotion, you have to have some kind of physiological arousal, and you have to then cognitively label that arousal. And so you could argue that those two things maybe precede the actual subjective experience. according to Schachter and Singer. So I don't have a conclusive answer for you on this. Who's right here? Who's to say? There's still research ongoing, and there's still debate in the psychological literature. Another question we can ask beyond the definition of emotions is maybe more specifically, which kinds of emotions can we define if we zoom in a little bit? What types of emotions are there? And so the question psychologists ask is, all right, can we establish some kind of basic system of emotions here? Are there basic emotions? Are there emotions that everybody has? Are there emotions from birth? Try to name them yourself, actually. Pause right now. Think about whether you can name all the basic emotions. What would you consider the essential nature of emotionality? If you distilled out everything else and you were left with only the purest form of emotion, what would it be? Try to make that list yourself. And once you've done that, expand the list. Name all the emotions you can think of, all the important ones. The English language is full of words to describe emotions, so you probably have a fairly long list if you paused and worked on it. But it's reasonable to follow up that statement with the question, well, okay, there are hundreds of words to describe emotions, but are there hundreds of emotions? Or are we just using different words to describe the same kind of thing in a slightly different way or in a slightly different context? It's an important question for sure, but kind of hard to answer. So when you look at your list, if we were in class together, we would probably compare our lists and we'd try to come up with a class-wide list. People usually have very many in common in their basic emotions list. Most people have things like anger, fear, happiness, and then in the longer lists we start to include things like interest maybe, loathing, jealousy, distraction, and then it's reasonable to discuss, like, okay, so is loathing its own thing, or is it just an extreme kind of anger? Hard to say. If you compile the list of every single person's list of emotions, how long would that list be? Probably really long, and therefore really difficult to research. So one way to define emotions psychologists have devised is using math, kind of. So this was developed by Russell, Watson, and Telligin, and so you can think of every emotion as a location on two dimensions. And so those dimensions are positivity and intensity. So if you've got a really intense negative, or how should I say this? A really low intensity positive emotion, you might call that relaxed. You're feeling good, but not like really intensely good. You just feel kind of chill. A really low intensity negative emotion might be this sort of like sad, sluggishy feeling. Maybe I could just put pandemic feeling over the top of sad and sluggish. And then a really intense positive emotion, so on the far right here, on the high end, it's going to be something like elated, joyful, thrilled, those kinds of words. And then the really highly intense negative emotions are going to be things like really angry, really loathing, or maybe even something distraught, something very sad, or terrified, very scared. So there's a little bit of a limitation to this in that you can't really separate out things like scared from angry. But in general, this kind of gives us at least some way to define the way emotions might relate to one another and to compare them it's a somewhat more a more controlled way, a more scientific way for sure. That's not the only approach, though. Psychologists have used the kind of labeling approach that we started with at the beginning. And in most cases, they distinguish between primary and secondary emotions. So you can kind of think of it a lot like primary and secondary colors. You use the primaries to create the secondaries. So these basic or primary emotions are going to be things that have an evolutionary explanation attached to them that seem adaptive. They're going to be shared across cultures. They're going to be more basic. They're going to appear earlier in life and in development. And they're probably going to be associated with specific biological and physical states. And so typically that list includes anger, fear, sadness, disgust, and happiness. And then it sometimes also includes surprise and sometimes even contempt. So then you can use those emotions to paint in the secondary emotions, things like remorse, guilt, submission, anticipation, jealousy, so on. There's a lot of work on this. Many researchers believe these are the sort of main 6 basic universal emotions. And they've argued for a long time that with really nice evidence that people don't really have trouble recognizing these 6 emotions in other people across cultures. You also find that when you ask people to match facial displays to emotion labels, people agree pretty widely on faces displaying these 6 basic emotions. You get a little more disagreement if you start to include the secondary emotions, but if you stick to these primaries, then people are pretty consistent across, I believe, across cultures as well. One of the well-known researchers in this specific area is a guy named Paul Ekman. Ekman and Friesen in the 70s tested members of a rural, isolated culture in New Guinea in which the people had basically no experience with Western culture, but when the researchers showed them Caucasian faces making those 6 primary emotions, they recognized them quickly and easily. And then when they took pictures of the people from New Guinea back and then took those photos back to the US to show to their primarily Caucasian undergraduates, they also recognized the emotions quickly and accurately. So it's not, there's a little bit of a limitation there in translation of language, so we don't know if the labels are exactly the same across cultures, but the fact that there's universal recognition of emotion from facial expressions is probably the most convincing piece of evidence that there are these kind of basic, primary, and even primal emotion displays. It suggests that there is some kind of biological or even genetic origin of these. You see a wide range of emotions in very young babies. Even if the baby is born blind or born hearing impaired, they have pretty much the same facial expressions as babies that are born seeing and hearing. And you can kind of try to develop an understanding of the evolutionary sensibility of some of these expressions. For one reason being that it's really convenient and efficient to communicate our emotions to each other this way. So it makes sense that we would develop it and that we would learn it quickly. But there's also some other evolutionary reasons that make some sense. Like disgust in particular is kind of compelling because it's this sort of thing, and it wrinkles your nose up and it kind of blocks your nose a little bit. The idea being that maybe it blocks some of the odor, so you don't have to smell the disgusting thing. And surprise widens your eyes so that you see better. You get a fuller picture of whatever is surprising you, so that you can react to it appropriately and safely. Those are 2 examples. The others, happiness doesn't really have a whole lot of evolutionary sensibility to it, because most often animals show each other teeth as a threat. It could be that humans have developed the understanding that we show teeth to each other as a non-threat. Anyway. I'm still here because Ekman is an interesting figure. He's done lots of really great work, but he's primarily published in book form, so he hasn't really put his work through rigorous peer review, and he's actually achieved a little bit of notoriety. There was a show on Fox a few years, like 10 years ago now, maybe more, partially based on him. He was the main scientific advisor to the show, and it was based on this sort of other theory he has about facial muscles and basic expressions, and how you could use it as a lie detection tool. That's a little more a little more controversial than the basic emotion literature, but it all is still. So with that in mind, we can ask the question of whether emotions have these biological bases. There's a little bit of other interesting evidence for that take. Comes from the 70s. It was done by James Laird primarily. He had people hold a pencil in their teeth or in their mouths in a way that produced either a smile, as you see on the right side of this slide, or a frown, as you see on the left side. And then did a bunch of studies where participants related how funny cartoons were, newspaper comics, and found that people who were in the posed smile, so had the pencil horizontal in their teeth, rated the cartoons as funnier than the people holding the pencil with their lips in a forced sort of pout. So the suggestion was that feedback from the muscles in the face determined part of the internal emotional experience. So this is called the facial feedback hypothesis. It suggests that people who are smiling are going to interpret themselves as happier. And so the people who were forced to smile while reading cartoons thought the cartoons were funnier because they had more, they felt the smile happening. Their face gave their cognitive system feedback. There's something sort of compelling about this, I think. It's an interesting possibility. It's something that my mom told me when I was a kid, smile until you feel better, right? You've probably heard that before. It's a solid mom thing, and I wonder if that sort of common knowledge was based on these studies in the 70s. Probably so. You can try it, like smile in a really exaggerated way. Give yourself a big cheesy smile right now. Do you feel different after you do it for a minute? I don't know, I feel crazier. I don't know if I feel happier necessarily. It's possible. Well, there's been a lot more work done on that question since the 70s, and the data end up looking something like this. So this is this is a number of different labs, all listed on the left there, the primary investigator in each lab, where they tried to find this same finding from holding a pencil in your mouth and looking for evidence of the facial feedback hypothesis. And the original study is shown on the top there. So there was a huge effect. You can see that so we're looking at the smile condition minus the pout condition, and we're looking at everybody's ratings of how funny the comics were. So if the difference is 0, then smiling and pouting didn't change anything, right? So here's the original study, huge effect. Everyone who smiled rated everything as much funnier than the people who pouted. And then these folks conducted a whole set of replication studies, a couple that found people rating the comics funnier in the smile condition. Here's one in which people found the comics funnier in the pout condition, and then a couple that just sort of, variation around the midline here. And when you put all those together, you get this meta-analytic effect size here, which is centered at the middle of this diamond, which is, really close to 0. In fact, it's 0.03. So I personally would say that this probably isn't a real effect. It's probably the case that this was a lucky or some other kind of finding in the first place, based on the way we used to do psychology in the 70s. And so the facial feedback hypothesis probably still sees some service in the literature, but the central study on which it was founded doesn't seem to work. And so I would again go back to maybe the Schachter model, what's their name? Schachter and Singer two-factor theory, that we have to cognitively understand our physical state to actually feel a change in emotion. And in this case, people understand it as forced, and so it doesn't change their emotion. There are a number of other interesting combinations of cognition and emotion. We all know that we overreact sometimes. We are overly emotional to small situations. We also can misattribute our emotions. And I have a nice example of that for you in just a second. And then the third interesting cognition and emotion finding is called the Yerkes-Dodson law, and it shows that over many, many different domains, moderate arousal turns out to be best for performance. So what I mean by that is, if you're about to take an exam and you're not really that worried about it, you might not do very well. If you are overly worried about it, you will probably also not do well. But if you're just the right amount of worried, if you're Goldilocks, then you will perform better than if you had been too worried or not worried enough. Part of the reason for that and our overreactions is that sometimes our emotional reaction can kind of skip through our cortex if it's strong enough and head straight to the amygdala, which will make us feel very intensely and maybe even physically overreact, which could make the emotion stronger because it will intensify our physical reaction. Now let me get back to this misattribution question. It's really fun. So misattribution of arousal is a term used when an emotion label is handed to the wrong source. So one of my favorite demonstrations of this, the researchers tried to see whether people could fall in love through misattribution. So they recruited a group of male participants and they asked them to meet an interviewer on one of two bridges over the Capilano River in British Columbia. So this is the famous Capilano suspension bridge on the slide here. It's gorgeous, and the view is terrifying. I've been there, and it's a narrow suspension bridge. It sways. It's over rocky rapids, and then in the other condition, the other participants were interviewed on a sturdy modern bridge just above the river. So they were down much lower, and it was built of wood, and it was solid because it was, I believe it came right off the ground. So two very different emotionality experiences. All these men were interviewed by a female research assistant who approached them and interviewed them about some sort of random things. And then she finished by giving them her phone number and offering to explain the results of the study at a later date. All they had to do was call. So sort of the debrief section. So the idea is that the men on the scarier bridge felt a general intensity in their emotionality that they might later misattribute to the interviewer, and that is indeed what happened. The men who interviewed on the suspension bridge were more likely to call the interviewer later and, rather than look for debriefing, ask her out, ask her if she wanted to go on a date. So their feeling of that emotional intensity was misattributed to her rather than to the experience of being on the scary bridge. You can think about that there might be a little bit of difference there between the men who chose to cross the bridge and those who chose the safer bridge. Maybe there's sort of a risk-taking difference there, and the riskier guys also were more likely to make the phone call. But the general idea that people can misattribute their arousal is seen in many other studies as well. This is just my favorite example of it. Cognition interacts with emotion in other ways as well. We sort of have different ways to attempt to cognitively regulate our mood. Sometimes we avoid situations that we know will cause strong emotional reactions that we don't want. That's cognitive regulation of mood. We also can reappraise events or focus on certain aspects of emotional reactions to try to change our feelings later on. So let's say you had a horrible experience that you later look back on and say, that actually built my character. That's cognitive reappraisal of a previous emotional situation. Laughing is also an interesting combination of cognition and emotion, particularly in that people sometimes laugh in situations that are not funny. People seem to be a little more prone to laughter, and sometimes in times when they shouldn't laugh. It's places like funerals or wakes, people laugh quite a lot. And the theory there is that laughing in that serious situation or sometimes scary situation or sad situation helps people kind of distance themselves from their negative emotion. It enables them to think, well, I'm laughing so I don't feel that bad. And in addition, there's a social aspect to it too. People feel more connected to one another if they're sort of laughing through sadness together in a moment like that. There are some bad ways, negative ways that cognition and emotion interact to lead us down the wrong path. The first of those is thought suppression, in which we try to not respond to or feel an emotion at all. But typically when we do that, no matter what kind of thought we're suppressing, it becomes harder and harder to suppress that thought over time. Leads to something called rebound effects, in which we think even more about the thing than we would have otherwise. There's a really famous study, not based in emotionality, but in which the researchers told their participants to do whatever they wanted over the next few minutes doing the task. Just try not to think of a white bear. And anytime you do think of a white bear, press this button. And people press the button constantly, because as soon as you say, don't think about this, we try to repress it, and it rebounds and comes back up. That's work done by Dan Wegner, by the way, a paper from 1990 that's very famous in cognitive psych. We also ruminate. That's a second mistake involving the combination of suppression of cognition and emotion, in which we just sort of continue to think about, elaborate, and focus on an undesired thought or feeling, which leads to prolonging of that mood. That rumination can impede successful mood regulation strategies. It can keep us from focusing on problem solving, or it can keep us from one other positive interaction between cognition and emotion, and that is distraction. Sometimes when we know our emotionality is too intense, we distract ourselves until we can deal with the emotion better later on. There are also social and cultural influences on emotion. For example, cultures that value individuality tend to display more visible emotions than more collectivist cultures. For example, in Chinese culture, personal emotions are much less visibly displayed than in American culture because of those differences. In sort of a collectivist culture, people are encouraged to adjust to others, and so their emotional displays are smaller at first, and they also are less likely to show them if other people aren't also showing them. But in a very individualist country, people are happy to show their emotions. I use an emotion in the description, but they show their emotions, and they often show them quite largely, even at baseline. And of course, there are gestural differences between cultures as well, in the way we show emotions and in the way we interpret emotions, the way we understand each other's emotions. So I tell you all this to say that just like everything else we've talked about this entire course, in every video here, the emotion is best described by combining biology, cognition, and social approaches. We've talked about a biopsychosocial approach to psychology, and that works very nicely for emotions as well. As I start to wrap this up, I'll give you the connections between emotion and personality in just a second. And before that, I want to give you the best evidence that I know of from psychology on how to encourage happiness in yourself. So, number one suggestion, money isn't everything. It can be hugely helpful, of course, to get to a certain level of comfort, but once you achieve that kind of baseline level of physical comfort and of security, trying to get more and more money doesn't actually make people more happy. Do whatever you can to feel in control of a situation when we do not feel in control, when our locus of control is outward. We are less happy in general. Try to engage yourself in your work. Try to feel like you are involved in what you're doing, especially if you're doing it every day. If you're constantly thinking about something else or imagining yourself elsewhere, that typically leads to lower general mood. If you have spare cash to spend on something and you want to use it wisely, things like trips or tickets to events tend to lead to longer-term happiness than objects. So if you buy the new cool thing, that's going to maybe make you feel really good for a little bit, but that will fade a lot faster than the positive memory of going to see a show with a close friend or going on a little vacation. Exercise and sleep, I'm sure you've heard that a million times, but both of those things make it much, much easier to live a generally happy life. Another one is to work on relationships. Try to have deep, close relationships with anybody, with friends, with family, whoever's around, so that you can have those kinds of exchanges of all the good and the bad, because that's what leads, that sort of richness of friendship, of relationship, is what leads to longer-term happiness. We see in lots and lots of data. And if possible, try to think of others. Most of the evidence shows that when people donate time, donate money, do other types of service, they feel better afterward. They feel longer-term happiness in general. Lastly, express gratitude. Try to think about the things that could make you happy or do make you happy on a daily basis and be thankful for those things. That tends to also increase our happiness. And maybe most importantly of all, this is a list of 8 things. You're not going to be able to do all these all the time, so don't stress if you're not doing all of them. Don't stress if you're only doing one of them. Do whichever one you can, and trust yourself. Okay, the big finale here, emotion and personality. So the most clear connection is that emotionality is established sometime as a trait. So it is one of, in one way we've just taken a really deep dive into one of the traits that are in many personality models. But emotion and personality seem to really be interesting and important in the development of each other, and conscience and gender and all those kinds of culturally determined pieces of knowledge that we have about ourselves and each other. So our conscience is our internal standard of conduct, the same sort of colloquial and psychological definition. But it emerges, as personality seems to, from children's experiences with their parents and their experiences with their peers. So if parents motivate children to respond constructively to their expectations and their requests, then and if parents' rules and their dealing with their children is based in understanding and in empathy for the child's biologically based temperament, then they can develop a healthy conscience, and they can develop an open and expressive and so potentially slightly more extroverted personality. Extroversion and introversion not really positive or negative in either direction, but certainly less neurotic personality as well. If parents work to think in an involved way about the development of conscience and personality as you react to a child's emotionality, which is essentially their temperament. So I don't know if we must have talked about this already, but children are born with a biologically based thing that is kind of the blueprint of their future personality that psychologists call temperament. And one of the primary features of temperament definitely is emotionality. And so what I'm trying to say here, and maybe this is a good summary statement, is that the way parents deal with that emotionality and temperament is what develops into conscience and personality for a child. The development of gender and gender identity is also an interaction among all these things: the biological experience, the social interactions children have, the influences on them as they grow up. They learn about it from their parents, their peers, their society in general, to develop conceptions of attributes. I have a 4-year-old niece who is very intensely interested in what girls and boys do and what they do differently right now. She's sort of trying to figure out who's who and what's what is maleness and what is femaleness, and all those kinds of things. Psychologists call these gender schemas, and so the development of those is something that children tend to focus on at some point early on. And then later again, by the way, when they negotiate things like puberty and the major biological transitions there. Oh, nice. That's what I just said. Cool. In bullet point form. All that kind of stuff combines to help children answer these questions. What kind of person am I? Who do I want to be? The combination of emotion and personality is what helps a child establish themselves as a moral actor. Am I a moral person? What does it mean to be a moral person? That's the critical combination between emotion and personality as we grow up. This is all, of course, closely related to attachment theory. You might want to review that here. We talked about it, though, in the emotional development lecture. And so to wrap all this up, we talked about the definition of emotion, and particularly the two different kind of axes we can place it on: high, low, and positive, negative. We talked about quite a lot about the combination of cognition and emotion, the basic nature of emotion, potentially the biological nature, and then the combination at the end here of emotionality and personality. That'll do it for the video. Thanks. See you next time.